Hey, Satenico here once again for God Loves Comics. And this is episode 3 of Original Artefacts. And this time we're going to step away from the Alan Moore collaborators and talk about 3 unassailable masters of the art form. And first up, who else but the King, Jack King Kirby. This is from Thor 137. What an instantly thrilling page. I've said before that of all of Kirby's work, I think this run on Thor is my favorite. And I think Kirby acolytes, while still loving the Thor stuff, often find it tainted by their irrational disdain for Vinnie Colletta. But I like Coletta's inks, and I think he was a master craftsman. And anyone faulting Colletta for occasionally cutting corners to make deadlines and or do more work to feed his family, apparently ignore 2 huge factors. Number 1, Kirby had absolutely the same work ethic, which is why he said after he penciled a book that he didn't care who inked it, and he was on to the next assignment. Number 2, when Kirby did the bizarre and short-lived Spirit World magazine in which he had total creative control and could choose any inker he wanted, he chose Vinnie Colletta. Granted, he may have had other choices who were simply too busy or contractually obligated, but he still ultimately chose Vinnie, which creates a narrative that does not jive with those of the Colletta haters out there. Anyway, in panel 1, you get a taste of several Kirby visual tropes. In the foreground, you have the backshot of this guy with a crazy hat or helm, nowhere on par with Kirby's mind-blowing designs of Odin's helms, but still fits the mode of Kirby going wild with hat design throughout his stint on Thor. Then you have the sort of generic dog soldier brutes with cinderblock fists carrying out orders. And finally you have the inevitable wild Kirby science fiction contraption with tubes and conductors and what looks like 3 mufflers from some American muscle cars. I will say, however, that the Kirby crackle here is terribly underwhelming. If Thor had the hats, it was the Fantastic Four where the Kirby crackle truly thrived. Panel 2, Grak hears and obeys, looking quite a lot like a Skrull getting his shoulder workout at Gold's Gym, or maybe a prison parolee cruising the hood again on a low rider complete with a banana seat. I like how Vinnie Colletta chose to add heavier shading on the extended left arm, even if I'm unsure if those 3 bold brush strokes from muscle just above the forearm are anatomically correct. And yet another reliable visual trope are those powerful Kirby sausage fingers gripping the, invasion shaft. Thanks, Stan. This big panorama at the center is quite simple in design and a little difficult to sort out, devoid of the colors that likely help define that what we are looking at is the Rainbow Bridge to Asgard, but Kirby and Colletta accomplish a nice bit of creating scale and the enormity of the bridge itself with the collection of sketchy little figures at the bottom of the panel. The last 2 panels really sell this page as they are both fascinating to look at and exciting in very different ways. Firstly, I don't recall ever seeing anything quite like the texture of this glove or hand in the foreground. If it's intended to look like chainmail, it fails, but it succeeds as if it were a reptilian hand or perhaps a skin condition. If that sounds critical, it's actually not, because the technique Colletta uses is incredibly interesting, and I'm not even sure what tool he deployed for this. Kirby crams all these hands holding various weapons into the immediate foreground of the panel, effectively placing the reader at the heart of the action, and frames the speaker in the background. There will be no retreat, no surrender, death to our enemies. Is that a young Vladimir Putin? After all, they do have troll farms in Russia. Finally, we get a close-up of this magnificent figure that harkens back to Kirby's days of doing monster anthologies for Atlas. But this troll has far better details than Kirby's usual lumpy monsters. In fact, he looks more like some of the ugly troll-like background people frequently populating Kirby's bizarre return to Captain America in the 70s, or perhaps one of his Fourth World hunger dogs. That gaping mouth stretches the entire width of the face and is populated not only with fangs, but jagged, square teeth. You can see an outstretched arm, a few escaped remnants of Coletta's scale technique from the prior panel, probably just finishing off the remaining ink. Thus, this little Klaus Kinski-esque beast lends perfect foreboding to the impending troll invasion of the pages immediately following. Lee, Kirby, and Colletta never failed to deliver on their incredible Thor run. Next up is the great Gil Kane on the page from Green Lantern 74 from 1970. The Kirby and Coletta page, by the way, was from 1967. Firstly, this is an example of Gil Kane actually having time to ink himself, which I don't think happened too often in this period, and you can see he goes with a heavier, more muscular line and shading than you would typically see around this time, often when he was inked by Sid Green. Just look at this Atom splash from 4 years earlier. This looks like Gil Kane on cruise control with much simpler pencils and a very light touch from Green, making this almost indistinguishable from the many bland and generic DC titles of the Silver Age. Now back to Green Lantern. While on the surface this may seem a disservice to Gil because it is the opposite of the kinetic action-packed pages of Kirby, this is actually a master class in dynamic storytelling. Kane takes a page of script entirely set in a bedroom with a sleeping couple and makes it visually thrilling without a single punch thrown or a villain in tights. Consider that How to Draw Comics the Marvel Way didn't come out until 1978, and yet Kane and Kubert and Kirby were long masters of dynamic action even when working for stodgy old DC. Of course, Byrne Hogarth quite literally wrote the book on dynamic anatomy back in the 40s with his work on Tarzan. Looking at this first panel, Kane perfectly draws Tom's right hand. Well-drawn hands and feet, Mr. Liefeld, are the first sign of a great draftsman. His fingers fumble for the radio's volume knob while his left hand, although not stifling a yawn, is in some typically awkward half-asleep position. Gil squeezes in a shot of Tom's wife, Turga, still sleeping blissfully so that she's established in the bed as well. By panel 2, Tom is leaping from the bed and both he and Turga are wide-eyed almost to the point of approximating manga. Both have classic Kane noses and always interesting Kane faces, and if there is one minor complaint, it's that Tom looks much younger than he did in the first panel. But let's face it, everyone is a bit of an ogre when they're awakening from a deep sleep. Kane delivers spontaneous and energetic brushstrokes for each character's hair, and interestingly enough, Tom's eyelashes are just as lovely as Turga's. The classic Kane nostril shots are fairly toned down here, although still present. Panel 3 does give us a shot of the hero, Green Lantern, in costume, although it is intended just to be a photo, and once again, Kane is physically incapable of drawing anyone in a boring or rote pose, so even the unconscious face-down GL looks interesting and dynamic. Kane also imposes another great hand shot, and this one clearly looks like he just used his left hand as a reference. The bottom two panels are equally dynamic with a backshot of Turga's hair dominating the foreground, and panel 4 as a shirtless Tom leaps into action. It's a great pose with his left shoulder obscuring his chin. Finally, in panel 5, Gil radically shifts the angle and perspective again, this time with Tom in the foreground and a rather pedestrian, worried Turga still in bed in the background. But Tom again looks magnificent. Although this angle and even his face, physique, and hair in motion all look quite a lot like Carmine Infantino, who I believe was art director at DC at the time. However, Tom's more feral features and nose definitely look like Kane, where Carmine would have gone with a more erudite nose. As I said, a masterclass in visual storytelling by Gil Kane, who makes this page every bit as engaging as any of the action pages. Additionally, while his characters are dynamic, they don't look wildly melodramatic or overposed as you see in many of those Marvel Age comics where the characters just walking appear to be aboard a listing Titanic instead of a simple sidewalk. All of Kane's panels here still have an impressive naturalism and credibility to them that is all the more impressive given how dynamic they look. And finally, the extraordinary Joe Kubert from Star Spangled War Stories 149. As a kid, if I had to rank these three artists, Kirby, Kane, and Kubert, I think I would have had Kubert solidly in third. I remember liking his stuff on Sergeant Rock, Tarzan, and even his work on Batman on the sporadic occasions I came across those books. But while it was fluid and muscular, it also looked a bit too loose, too sketchy, especially when compared to the airtight likes of my favorites at the time, George Perez, John Byrne, and even Michael Golden. But even then, I sensed Kubert was special, although somehow his punches didn't quite have the oomph that left me fully satisfied at the time. But now as an adult, While Kirby is the undeniable king of exciting, bombastic imagination in comics, and Kane is an endless source of kinetic joy, in terms of pure draftsmanship and a genius level of skill, I would have to put Kubert at the top. If it just came down to a convention draw-off, the ambidextrous Kubert seems like the one who would win every time, blindfolded, with one hand tied behind his back. He's the artistic equivalent of Robert Redford in The Natural. Look it up. Anyway, while so much of Kubert's work has an effortless fluidity to it and often a line so delicate it looks as if the brush barely touched the paper, this page shows Kubert as a master of mood as well, as he deploys a variety of techniques and line weights to illustrate enemy aces' inner turmoil. Panel 1 is as basic an establishing shot as you could ever hope for. There's no Michael Kaluta flair to Kubert's moon. It is merely there to signify that it is dusk. The ever so simple silhouettes at the bottom of the panel do effectively tell us that these are biplanes though. Panel 2, however, is rife with a variety of textures to help blunt Bob Kanigher's often pretentious, bordering on purple prose. I am cold, cold, though my fireplace crackles. Kubert uses thick, chunky, and imprecise brush lines to define the lattice work of the shutters in the foreground. Then small, precise, but heavy black lines for the wire mesh around the fireplace. And finally, some random, impatient squiggles to effectively depict the floral rug under Von Hammer's feet. Last, we get a close-up of Von Hammer's troubled face. His hair is a splash of black with a sweep of bangs defined by a few casual brushstrokes. Kubert doesn't fuss with the ear canal at all, with just a couple of perfectly placed squiggly lines. But he goes a bit crazy with Von Hammer's brow. It's a heavy, craggy line that forms a unibrow across the width of his face, except that despite the line weight being the same, you instinctively process the center part as merely a crinkling of Von Hammer's brow, not a continuation of hair. His pupils are just simple circles and a dot. That somehow looks perfect. And his face is overlapped by a model of his biplane, which Kubert has stippled with a single zipatone pattern that he has cut into small patches and pieced them together so that the lines of each piece run in different directions. It's remarkably effective. The background is black at the top before giving way to cross-hatching that steadily evaporates as it makes its way down the page. Finally, there's this half-page powerhouse of a panel where a frustrated Von Hammer crushes the model in his hands. Gone is the zipatone merely giving way to Kubert's incredible cross-hatching technique. The brushwork is so fiercely energetic and spontaneous, surely no one has ever looked at a Joe Kubert piece and called it stiff. Unfortunately, Von Hammer's face in this moment is a spitting image of Sergeant Rock's. Von Hammer's narrowing eyes, deeply furrowed brow, hawkish nose, and gritted teeth truly represent an embedded trope in Kubert's style when depicting male anger. It is devastatingly effective. It just is odd that an aristocratic German fighter pilot would bear such a striking resemblance to a grizzled, rough-and-tumble American foot soldier. Nevertheless, Joe Kubert's storytelling mastery and facility with an ink brush is almost without parallel. And that's it for episode 3 of Original Artefacts featuring Jack Kirby, Gil Kane, and Joe Kubert. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Feel free to tell me any artists that you would like me to cover. And thanks very much for listening, and come back soon because we'll be doing more. Bye.